Welcome to Formulaic Fun. My name is Sarah, and today I have a question for you. When you hear the word spectrum, what shape comes to mind? When you think about the two polar opposite ends of this spectrum, what separates the two of them? Is it a line? And how do you get from one end to the other end of that spectrum? Well, today I'd like to present you with a question, a thought. What if spectrums are circles and not lines? Let's go ahead and dive into this thought. So let's think of maybe the most basic spectrum that we can. A spectrum that has a start and a finish. Right? Those are two distinct ends. You can't be at one place at the same time, or so we've always been told, right? So, what happens in this spectrum? Well, in this spectrum, I can decide that I'm going to start it, and from that start, I can end up at any given point. Okay? I can even end up from the start all the way down to the end. Right? Or I can end up in any given spot other than the end. But what about if I hit the end? If I'm at the end, what happens then? Are there any rules that say I can't restart? Well, what happens if I decide I want to restart? Well, I could decide I want to start the race or whatever the task may be completely over again. And we head all the way back to the start. Or I could decide I want to restart from somewhere in the middle. That's perfectly fine too. But what happens here is this line isn't actually a line. This line is intrinsically a circle. And we've been programmed to believe that really it's only just a line, but there's more that's happening here. Let's take another example. We have birth and death. This is probably the most distinct spectrum that we will ever experience in our given human lifetimes. At some point in time, we were born, and we know inevitably at one point in time we will die, right? And we've been told to believe that this is simply a progression of time. It's all linear and just a line. But let's think about this a little bit more deeply. What if, let's say, I'm in my adolescence, I'm in my youth, the prime of my life, right? I'm probably somewhere along here in the birth to death ratio. If we're thinking that we're going to have a long, happy life, maybe live until we're 70 or 80 years old. Well, what if we're somewhere in our middle ages, right? We're in our 50s or 60s. We're going to be somewhere here in that birth to death spectrum, right? We were born, and now we're here. Well, eventually, we do all have to pay that price, and we do get to death. And it is there, right? But once again, we see that it's a circular path there. And let's think about death. Right now, we have half of a circle. But what about all those risky moments in your life? All of those near-death encounters, right? All of the times where you took it just a little too far and it made you rethink things. It almost made you have some kind of a rebirth of sorts, right? Or what if something happened to you where you get into a near-death accident and you lose your memory and maybe you lose your motor skills? Well, you're going to be starting somewhere closer back to birth. And what if you have an actual death experience where you come back to life? Well, then you are entirely back at the start. So once again, we see that this spectrum that we've been told our whole lives is just some linear path. It's actually circular. In our next example, we have the left and the right. We can think about this in several different spectrums. We can think about this in a spectrum of being left-handed versus right-handed, a spectrum of going to the left or going to the right, right? Or maybe even possibly the political spectrum of being on the left or being on the right. But whichever spectrum we want to consider with this example, what we want to see is that even though we've been told that these two sides, the very far left and the very far right, are so different from one another, right? This is actually something that can be seen as circular as well, right? So if I think about me being in the very center of this spectrum, right? If I'm standing in the very, very center, and somebody tells me to go to the left, somebody tells me to turn to the left, well, what happens? Okay, so if I'm told to turn to the left, I'm going to go a little bit that way. And if you tell me to go a little bit further to the left, I'm going to continue to go even further to the left. And if you tell me to go even further to the left one more time, well, wouldn't you know it, I'm going to end up somewhere on the right. But if you can tell me, continue to go left, well, I'm going to end up somewhere back where I started. So, what if, on the other hand, I told you to go to the right? Well, let's see what happens there. So, let's once again say that we're at that center point, and we want to go this time to the right. So, I'm going to go to a little bit to the right. I'm going to turn. You tell me to go turn right again. I'm going to turn right again. Now I'm going to end up somewhere on the left side. And you tell me to go right one more time. Maybe a few more times after that. And I'll end up somewhere back where I started, but I am going to end up on the other side for a little bit. So, it's important to recognize that even though this spectrum, right, we've been told is once again something that's linear, just a line, it's not. And that's because we stand at a given point in space and time. And that point, we can turn any way we want. And that turning ability is also circular. So, the left and the right is circular. The next example we have is up versus down. Up versus down is very similar to the example of left versus right. So, in up versus down, we have been told that up is very distinct and down is also a very distinct place, given wherever you are at a given point in time, right? So let's imagine once again that I'm standing in that dead center. What happens if you tell me to go up? So if I am told to go up, I'm going to go up, and at some point, when I'm going all the way up, that version of up starts to become down, given just where I am at a given point in time. And if I continue to go up, I'm going to end up back where my up originally started. Circular. Let's think about down. In the case of going down, you tell me to first go down, so I initially go down. But as I go down, at some point in time, my down ends up becoming what was originally my up. And if I continue to go down and down and down, then originally I'm going to go back to where I was at my original down. But this process, once again, is circular. The next example we have is color. So with color, this spectrum, most of us, we're actually pretty comfortable with thinking about this already as being kind of circular, right? When we think about red versus green or purple versus yellow, those nice complements to one another, we already see them as opposites from one another in a wheel or a circle, right? And so this should be almost comforting, right? There's a lot of spectrums that we have already in our lives that have been shown to us in circular ways, but for some reason or another, we've trained ourselves to not see them that way. So let's think about this maybe a little bit further. So in this example, we're going to build upon the idea of colors. So colors are not only just on a color wheel, a spectrum that helps us determine which things are most complementary to each other and which colors are warm and cool, but we can also see somewhat of a circular pattern that happens just with our eyes when we are actually taking in a given color or not taking in a given color. So in this example, we're going to be thinking about what happens when we see the color blue. Okay, so when we see the color blue, what happens to us is actually what we find is every other color other than blue is being absorbed here into this given triangle. Okay, and blue is being reflected outwards to us. So we get something that's almost kind of circular. Well, what happens when we, for instance, don't see the color blue? In this example, what if we're seeing the color orange? What's happening with the color blue in this particular triangle? Well, what we find is that blue is actually going in here. That blue, maybe that got reflected off from here, is being absorbed in with all of the other colors too that are also being absorbed, and then orange is being reflected outward to us and maybe potentially being absorbed over here. So what we find is that with colors we have a circular pattern. In our last example, we have white versus black in terms of the light spectrum. So white is defined as the presence of all color at the same exact time, while black is defined as the absence of all color at the same time. So what's happening to each of these? Let's imagine that this line is the line that separates what's being absorbed versus what's being reflected back out to us, the viewer. So if we are seeing the color white, what is happening there is that all colors are being absorbed, and what is coming out of that, what's being reflected out to us, the viewer, is white. You can think about this as almost like a type of bubble, right? A bubble that comes out where we can see all of the light at one time. We have a bubble of light coming in, and we have a bubble of light coming out. But what happens with black? So with black, what we see happen is we see light that's trying to be absorbed, right? It tries, but it ends up getting reflected back out. Every single time that a color tries to get absorbed, it gets reflected back out. We see nothing. So once again, we end up with something here that's circular. These two ends of the spectrum that we thought were so far away from one another are actually interconnected to one another. And that maybe instead of these 2 points being polar opposite, maybe these 2 points are actually connected in some strange way. It's just a concept, but tell me what you think about it, and tune in next time. Thanks for watching.